it doesn't matter how much demand goes up for Bitcoin, the supply curve never changes. And that's not true for any other asset in history, right? As price goes up for any asset, gold, copper, food, producers are incentivized to produce more.
Yeah, and that's because, for those of you who don't know, there's 21 million. That's all there ever be. And I don't think people really realize that. So that's
the first fixed supply asset in history. We've never had anything like it.
To make a move like that, you have to have kahunas and conviction.
Long term, I'm bullish. We could see about a 20% correction next year.
And this is Josh Jalinski, the financial quarterback. Don't touch that dial. Hi, everybody. This is Josh Jalinski, the financial quarterback. And we're being joined by self-proclaimed freedom maximalist, Bitcoin superstar, whatever you call yourself, Robert Breedlove, who, by the way, I met on vacation. And we had a lot of fun. Am I allowed to say where you are or no?
Yeah, that's fine. We are in Kauai, and you and I met in Kauai.
Yeah.
Just by happenstance with our families on the beach. So that was a interesting synchronicity.
Yeah. And we could talk about Bitcoin, raising the next generation, all those good stuff. But I'll ask you some more general questions about your work as a Bitcoiner. Talk a bit about what that means for our audience, that you call yourself a self-proclaimed freedom maximalist. And those that are not familiar with your work, kind of what is your origin story with Bitcoin and becoming kind of a Bitcoin celebrity in the last year or two?
You know, for starters, on the title Freedom Maximalist, I guess 250 years ago, you could have just called me an American, or perhaps more recently than that, just a libertarian. But a lot of these terms have been so twisted and distorted over the past, especially in the past, say, 30 to 50 years, that I found it to really get my philosophical views across, I needed to be abundantly clear. And freedom maximalism, I think, is about as clear as you can be. And so a couple things about this. You know, freedom is something that's very deeply ingrained in American culture, obviously. I would argue that the United States, as a socioeconomic experiment, is the greatest success story of a freedom implementation the world has ever seen. And what I mean specifically by that is that, led by the United States, we could say Western civilization more broadly, it's been so successful because it's rooted on the foundational values of life, liberty, and property. Now, in the American Constitution, we have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And there are reasons related to that I don't necessarily want to go into, but suffice it to say, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to pursue happiness without strong, high-integrity, fortified property rights. Because if you can't, as Ayn Rand said, control the fruits of your own labor, then you can't really control anything else in the world. You know, property is a very essential aspect of autonomy and agency. So the thing about life, liberty, and property, which they're ancient concepts, actually. They had been around since, before the 1200s. They'd been talked about, but they were ratified in the year 1215 in the Magna Carta. And the principles were particularly life, liberty, and inviolable property, meaning that property that cannot be violated. And what life, liberty, and property represents they're basically just three temporal aspects of freedom. So the right way to think about this, in my opinion, is if I take your life, if I murder you, this means I've essentially stolen your future freedom, right? I've taken your life away from you. If I take your liberty, this means I have imprisoned you or constrained you in some way. So I have taken away your present freedom. And if I violate or confiscate your property, this is me stealing the fruits of your past freedom. So I view very fundamentally life, liberty, property as just these three fundamental temporal aspects of freedom that a proper civilization is based on. And you could sum this whole thing up. This gets into the realm of natural law. You could sum all of this up in the dictum, do not steal. If you realize that property can be generalized even to the self, we often say person and property, but we could similarly say that each of us is our own most personal property. Like, I own myself first and foremost. That's the first thing I own in this world. And it's also a property right. I cannot even give it away, right? This is an inalienable property right. I cannot transfer my ownership of myself to anyone. It's not possible. So when you boil life, liberty, and property down into do not steal, that becomes the fundamental axiom. And in that rubric of do not steal, again, if person is considered, that also encapsulates violence and murder and all these other things. So I think the civilizational dictum is encapsulated in do not steal, which encompasses life, liberty, and property. And this is really something we've been struggling with as a species. The entirety of human history is one that's marred with criminality. We've been stealing from one another and killing each other for as long as we've been in existence, but we've been striving to construct these systems that restrain us from our more animalistic impulses and promote higher civility. And again, back to America, being the greatest success story in that regard, we built this country and we built the unparalleled success of our economic story on the basis of life, liberty, and property. And in particular, it was strong, reliable, indifferent rule of law, sound money, and this notion that I would argue is we inherited from the Judeo-Christian worldview, that the sovereignty of the individual is actually higher than the sovereignty of the state. And this is not something we had in previous implementations. So I say all of that to say that in my view, as a freedom maximalist, I think we are best served by optimizing the life, liberty, and property of individuals. And that actually promotes the greatest interest of any collective, no matter where you draw the lines around the collective. And finally, I would say that just as one counter argument, people have countered freedom maximalism because they say, if you take a maximalist position, that means you're going to push an individual attribute to its maximum regardless of any, collateral damage it may cause. And that's often not ideal. What you don't want to be a maximalist is the counter argument. You want to be an optimalist, as Balaji said to me once. And what an optimalist is an individual that has, in the scope of their maximalism, they have some limiting principle, right? So you might say, I'm a ice cream maximalist until I get a stomach ache, and then that's my limiting principle to not have any more ice cream, something like that. But the funny thing about freedom, again, if you consider life, liberty, and property, these temporal aspects of freedom, I think that freedom maximalism is inherently self-regulating, because if you honor that principle of inviolable property, what you're essentially saying is that I believe we should maximize the freedom, wealth, and autonomy of all individuals up to the boundary of the private property rights, which again includes person and property of others. That is the limiting principle. So freedom has a self-limiting principle built into it when you consider that property is an aspect of freedom itself.
So back in the day, you'd be called a libertarian, and now you want to be called a freedom maximalist. I'm all for being a freedom. Problem. I'm a freedom maximalist. The problem with libertarian, I'll be one. Is that libertarians are a political party, and I don't believe in politics. I don't think politics or statism works at all. So what would you be called, an anarcho-capitalist? Would that be your term?
Yeah, some people call it anarcho-capitalism. It's also been called agorism, which is just all human interaction should be voluntary, consensual, and free. No coercion, no compulsion, no violence, no imposition whatsoever.
That seems very idealistic. Do people like push back at that?
Of course they do. Yeah, people push back, and perhaps it is idealistic. And I would say that before the invention of Bitcoin, it was very idealistic. We never had a proper implementation of that ancient concept of inviolable property until the invention of Bitcoin. So now, what I'm doing now is educating the world about all the studies I have gone into as a result of getting into Bitcoin, which we can talk about that origin story, and hopefully helping usher this idealized future into reality, because now it's actually possible. We always needed a monopoly on violence, or a big man, or a regime with power, basically, right, that exerted political and physical force to preserve the integrity of property rights within a given territory. So you always needed a monopoly on violence to prevent violence and honor the boundary of property. But with the invention of Bitcoin, and again, this is something we can go into
and
more
by
deeply if you
monopoly
like.
of violence, you mean the state,
The state.
of acting as,
Correct.
or government forces to kind of coerce people to do things. So if you don't wear
Sure,
a mask,
we needed-
you're imprisoned. When we were in Hawaii, if you walked into the grocery store without a mask, they were going to call the police. And
Yeah, exactly.
like that.
And nobody likes that. So that's part of freedom maximalism, I guess. The thing about Bitcoin is that, so yes, you needed the monopoly on violence, which is the state, which is essentially us outsourcing our defense. So this is a very important aspect of property, is that it's only your property. And let me clearly define what property means, by the way. It's not the thing. It's not the car. It's not the house. It's not the stock certificate. It is the relationship or the bond between the owner and the asset, right? I have an exclusive relationship to the home that I own, such that anyone that comes in there and lays on my couch, I can eject them from the home, right? Or I have recourse to state security mechanisms like the police or what have you. So this is a very important point, that property is only inviolable to the extent that you can defend that relationship. And we've outsourced a lot of this to the state, right? The state that's really its purpose, is to establish a boundary within which citizens have property rights. And then the state earns revenue from preserving those property rights through taxation. Property was always then dependent upon the monopoly on violence, right? It's at the leisure of the state until the invention of something like Bitcoin. And this is something some of my work goes into, is that Bitcoin is the first private property right independent of the monopoly on violence. It's an informational bearer asset, which is to say whoever holds that information, which is called the private key in Bitcoin, holds the property, right? There's no arbiter that needs to acknowledge or enforce that relationship. It's just a matter of possession. And so this gives a great, an unparalleled degree of power, sovereignty, and autonomy to individuals that no other property right in history ever could.
How about, though, if the state, just kind of play devil's advocate, if the state then coerces you to give up your private key because it wants, like the Canadian trucker envoys, now they were really, I think, on exchanges, but I think if it goes a step further and people become more knowledgeable of Bitcoin, maybe give me your private key or else we're going to lock you up. I mean, do you worry about stuff like that?
No, I don't, actually. The other thing that's interesting about Bitcoin is because
Why don't you worry about that?
I'll tell you right now. So again, informational bearer asset, right? You have a private key that is your Bitcoin. By virtue of it being
explain
a digital,
a private key for people who are new to Bitcoin.
The simplest analogy is that it's the password to your Bitcoin. So you have a public address, which would be like your email address, You can share that publicly, no problem. And then you have your private key, which is effectively your email password, right? You don't share that publicly. Only you have access to what comes into that email address via the email password. That's essentially the same relationship with a Bitcoin public address that you share. You can send Bitcoin to me here, scan this QR code, whatever. But then the private key is what authorizes you to move funds from that address. So just think of your private key as your Bitcoin password. That's kind of the rough, simple analogy. There's a lot of power in that password becoming the asset, right? It's just information. So with something like gold or physical cash, gold you have to bury in your backyard or put it in a safe. You have to actually provide physical security for it. You can put it in a vault in a bank. With cash, you can do the same. You put it in a vault with a bank. A lot of cash today is just actually electronic entries on a centralized database maintained at the Federal Reserve. So that is, you're trusting someone, right? There's counterparty risk associated with that. And in particular with fiat currency, there is massive counterparty risk, especially related to inflation and deauthorization, which we can get into. But with Bitcoin, you have this password that effectively is like holding physical gold, but it enables you to have all these unique custody arrangements where, like, the way I do my Bitcoin custody is I'm in a geographically distributed multi-signature custody schema. That's a mouthful. What is that? You take the key, the password itself, and you chop it into a number of pieces. Some people do 3, 5, 7. You can do it any number of ways. And then you distribute those pieces, individual pieces of the key, to trusted individuals, right? This might be your accountant, your attorney, your wife, whoever is in your circle of trust. And then you establish a quorum where, say, 3 of 5 or 5 of 7 are necessary to unlock and move funds. So what this does is it gives you basically have sovereignty over your assets. You still have control over them, but you have redundancy. So if you lose one of those segments of the key, you do not lose all your money. Whereas if you're holding all of your Bitcoin private key yourself and you lose your password, you're toast, right? There's no Bitcoin CEO or HQ to call and have them reset your password. It's gone. So you have to be there's a great degree of power imparted by holding a Bitcoin private key, but there's a commensurate level of responsibility that comes with that. And so I don't worry about the state coercing me because there's not a lot they can do. Even if you come and kidnap me and torture me, I can't give you what I don't have, right? I have my Bitcoin in a multi-signature custody arrangement that's subject to certain protocols and time locks for me to even access the funds. There's not like a password I can give to you that you can just take my key. So with something like Bitcoin custody, this is what I say often, that held properly, Bitcoin is the actual implementation of that ancient principle of inviolable property, because there's no one that can violate the relationship between you and that Bitcoin, so long as you custody it properly. And this is a great, great power. This is the basis of civilization, and this is the power to hold the state in check, right? If they can't inflate the money supply and they can't arbitrarily confiscate property or violate property, let's say, then they cannot necessarily enrich themselves through coercion and violence. And then they are forced instead to be accountable to the preferences of citizens, which is what we all want our government to do in the first place. So I opened a lot of branches to the rabbit hole there. You let me know which direction you want to go.
How would you hold the Bitcoin? A multi-sig wallet, which is a really cool explanation of it. Do you go to a Coinbase? Obviously not with how you've described it. Cold storage. Like, where do people start if they're very new to this? Because they're a little scared about holding their own Bitcoin.
I always advocate for people to start with knowledge. I think your portfolio construction should really reflect your worldview, right, and your conviction and your understanding. So I always advocate for people to first learn about Bitcoin and then to buy just enough make you think about it more, right? I've noticed for myself that where my money goes, my mind follows, right? This is a natural psychological relationship humans have with money and property. They tend to think about, places they've vested their time and energy and wealth, capital, things like that. So I think it's very useful once you've equipped yourself with a basic understanding of Bitcoin. It's very useful to buy a little bit, at least to just get the gears turning, get you thinking about it more, paying more attention. Once you've decided to start buying, there's any number of exchanges in the U.S. Coinbase is known as the most popular one. I would actually advise against Coinbase. They have a bad reputation, a terrible reputation for customer service, and they also sell customer information to feds. So they've been selling information to a number of federal agencies. So I typically do not recommend that. I personally use an exchange called Swan. It's an LA-based exchange, and they provide a very simple service. They are Bitcoin only, and they allow you to set up a recurring purchase. So this is called dollar cost averaging, effectively, where you say, every month, every week, every day, whatever your chosen frequency is, buy X dollars of Bitcoin. And then secondarily to that, I'm also able to set up an automatic withdrawal to cold storage, which is that geographically distributed multi-signature custody arrangement I described. So that's it for me. Is I set this, it's a set it and forget it, right? Buy X dollars of Bitcoin every day. I actually buy Bitcoin daily. And then when that buy hits a certain amount, it automatically withdraws it to my cold wallet. I also do opportunistic Bitcoin buying. So I run a business, and my income is not steady. It comes in waves. So should I get a bulk of USD coming in at any given opportunity, I'll be opportunistic and try to buy a Bitcoin price dip. And for me, and that's it. I try to just accumulate Bitcoin. I'm just trying to accumulate more and more position on the network. Because one thing that's funny about Bitcoin is once you get into it, no matter who you are, we all have the same amount, which is not enough. And it becomes quite the game of accumulation. You think about it like the ultimate land grab, right? When the pioneers went west, there used to be these races to go out and stake claim to land and do all this homesteading. And I think something similar is playing out on this digital network we call Bitcoin, because it's the first and only what I've described as absolutely scarce money, meaning that the supply of money is perfectly inelastic to demand. It doesn't matter how much demand goes up for Bitcoin, the supply curve never changes. And that's not true for any other asset in history, right? As price goes up for any asset, gold, copper, food, producers are incentivized to produce more. So supply and demand always reach kind of a dynamic equilibrium in that way. But the problem with that is you get a lot of that increased demand gets satisfied through increased production. But with Bitcoin, we have something where the supply completely does not change. So all of that increased demand is expressed exclusively through the price. And that is what I would argue is a large contributor to Bitcoin's notorious volatility in dollar denominated terms.
Yeah, and that's because, for those of you who don't know, there's 21 million. That's all there ever be. And I don't think people really realize that. So that's
the first fixed supply asset in history. We've never had anything like it.
What about those who say that, the miners, talk about that for kind of a primer to mining and nodes, and people get confused when they start going down the rabbit hole. You're a great communicator on Bitcoin's simplicity. Philosophically, you get kind of deep, but I've noticed with Bitcoin, you make it really simple and clearly communicated. What would you, and I don't want to get into philosophy, all these cool things we were talking about. Did you watch Spartacus yet? I told Robert.
I watched half of it last night, actually.
Was it good?
It's a long one.
Did you like it?
It's good, but I couldn't get through all of it because of our daughter keeping us.
It's a 3-hour, It's a very long movie, but I think it kind of captures the moment we're in, don't you? Like, people are kind of fighting against the man. They don't really know what they're doing. They just want freedom. They're sort of enslaved, but they don't even know why they're enslaved. And that's why I do love your podcast, because we are philosophically enslaved, theologically enslaved, hermeneutically enslaved, monetarily enslaved, from years of really brainwashing. You know, I don't know if it's attributed to Marx, but we talked about this, like the implications of what you're saying. You know, the first tax we should go after is in localities to go after property taxes. Because if your rights are inviolable and the right of property is that, then really property tax is more of an offense to that than even income tax. I mean, they're both in some way. But people say, well, what can I do? I mean, I was thinking your stuff's kind of after we met, you were introducing me to some of your concepts. I was kind of going back to college and just all the philosophy classes I took and how I just loved that. And I would say, well, where would I start? And I thought, you know what? Go to your school board, go to your town, and really do a number on property taxes. But then that ties into education. So even how you educate one's children will eventually, because the first thing when you want to lower property taxes, they say, oh, the kids. You don't want to cut Sally's teacher's salary or, whatever. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about that. But first, your take on Spartacus, and then we'll get to that.
I really like Spartacus, and I hope to finish that movie. I think now, on this topic, would probably be useful for me to just lay out a quick origin story for me, and then I'll talk about taxation and education and a relationship there. So my educational background is I have an undergraduate and master's degree in accounting and finance, and I have a focus in taxation, actually. So I really learned about the ugly underbelly of the beast we call the state here, and how it administers this fraudulent system that we call taxation. And we think, we think not only is it normal, we think it's a certainty, right? The old adage of the two certainties in life, death and taxes. So I didn't know at the time when I was getting this education, I didn't understand that taxation is theft. Like, that's all it is. And I'll try to unpack that a bit more. But so at the time, I didn't understand it necessarily. I got my master's degree in accounting and finance. I went into public practice as a CPA. I was a licensed CPA in Tennessee for a number of years. I was focused on entrepreneurial consulting services. So basically helping high net worth individuals and investment partnerships, large capital pools, save money on taxes. I decided that the linear CPA career path was not the right fit for me. I was much more entrepreneurial spirit. So I decided to basically go into private business. I was a CFO, mostly focused in tech. So I was in a hospitality technology firm. I was with a healthcare software firm. And then finally ended up launching my own business, which was focused on kind of CFO consulting, but what would become a crypto hedge fund business. So this was late 2016, early 2017. I had heard about Bitcoin, had sort of been skeptical, like many do when they first hear about it. And then after a number of exposures, it started to catch on to me that actually this concept of smart contracts really piqued my interest. So I started to pay attention. And then I realized that basically Bitcoin is disruptive to gold. And we can go into that more later. But so that was my light bulb moment. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to start allocating into this space pretty heavily. And again, that was late 16, early 17. 2017, the market was up 1,800% in a year. So during that time, everyone that knew me and knew what I was working on was, reaching out to me a lot. Like, what is this? What is Bitcoin? What are these other things? So that was kind of the foundation from which we launched the business. And then after doing the hedge fund business for a couple of years, where our benchmark is Bitcoin, right? We're trying to outperform buy and hold Bitcoin, which is extremely difficult, by the way. So for listeners out there that may feel the need to speculate on other assets, buy and hold Bitcoin is the simplest, most difficult to outperform investment strategy there is over the past 13 years. And for reasons we can get into, I think it's going to continue to be that way. So I decided I wanted to, and this was feedback from the market, right? Throughout this experience, I'm talking and writing a lot. I'm getting a lot of feedback from people saying they really enjoyed me talking about Bitcoin, really enjoyed my writing. So I decided to lean into that and start this show, which I call the What is Money Show. And I named it that because I really believe that asking that question, what is money, does a couple of things. One, it surfaces other really important questions like what is property, what is government, what is value, what is accountability, what is exchange. All of these presuppositions we have about our socioeconomic reality that they're hidden in plain sight. We never question them, right? They're just so obvious that we never stop to think about them. And one of the things, so to speak to the tax piece, and again, I said taxation is stuff, and I wanted to unpack that. I would encourage people to check out the work by Rothbard. This is Murray Rothbard. He's an American philosopher, libertarian philosopher, and Austrian economist. And essentially, he makes a very strong and compelling argument that statism is the only business that does not derive its revenues from mutual voluntary exchange. So, everyone gets an IRS, if you're in the U.S. at least, then you get a bill from the IRS every year. You don't get to negotiate the price. You don't get to negotiate the terms. You have no say-so whatsoever. You are given a command to pay this organization under the threat of, legal recourse, imprisonment, etc. So, and people may, okay, well, we need that. We need to build the roads. We need defense, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, okay, fine. Think about it this way. If your effective tax rate is 100%, then you are, by definition, a slave. That's literally how you quantify a slave. If I work and all of the product of my work, 100% of it, goes to someone else, and I have no control or autonomy over the product of my own labor, the fruit of my own past freedom, then I am a slave, right? So, and similarly, if your effective tax rate is 0%, then you control all of the product of your own labor. You own all of the fruits of your past freedom. You are what I would call a sovereignist, someone it's the opposite of a slave, effectively. So using that view, you can determine whatever your effective tax rate is, this is effectively the rate at which you are enslaved. And this is something, again, that we take for granted. We say, oh, it's just normal. Everyone has it. The state's always been here. Death and taxes are a certainty. Just live with it. But we've overcome things in the past, too. If you go into ancient Rome, I think the population there was at one time, I forget which book I was reading, say the population is around 300,000. Maybe 50,000 of those were free people at the time, whereas the other 250,000 were slaves. And that was the norm, right? Everyone owned a few slaves. You had to keep up with household chores and, all the maintenance and gardening and all the things that needed to be done. You just owned some slaves. And that was normal. Well, that ceased being normal, right? And I would argue, again, a lot of this has to do with the emergence of Christianity, that just was not taken to be the norm anymore. And where I think we're at in the digital age is that we're at a point where it's time for us to evolve past our modern version of slavery, which is statism. And we could get a little more specific with that and say it's central banking. I think central banking is what enables a lot of this to grow unchecked. For instance, if we're going to go to war today, politicians are much more likely to just print the money necessary to go to war because they don't need to ask anyone. There's no legislation. There's no political process. There's no argument. You You just issue the debt and have the central bank buy it with freshly printed money, and you go spend the money. Whereas if they did not have a monopoly on the money printer via the central bank, governments would be forced to go out and raise revenue to go to war, right? Just like any other business that wants to engage in some new enterprise, they'd have to go pull the money together to do that. And they would do that through either direct taxation, which people would, it's much more visible and obvious when someone sends you a bill and says, hey, your taxes went up $50,000 this year because we're going to war. People are more likely to resist that. Or they could go through the bond market, right, issuing war bonds and things like that. But both of those routes, increasing tax revenue or borrowing, these are very explicit and visible and legible to taxpayers. So people are much more likely to resist. And I think that resistance is what holds government in check. But governments have been circumventing that resistance over the past 100 plus years via the central bank and fiat currency, where you just print money ad infinitum. Nobody understands how the monetary system works anyways. We've been conditioned and indoctrinated to believe that inflation is the normal way of things. And so governments can effectively soft default or externalize the cost of all their bad decision-making onto productive populations via inflation. And I think the whole thing is just a modern, watered-down form of slavery.
Yeah, simple kind of slogan would be, inflation is stealth taxation. Like who said that?
That's right. And taxation is stuff.
I mean, that's where I think the solution is very localized, people getting involved. I think COVID taught us, we didn't need, in some ways, even public schools, which are a big profit center for the state, because parents could band together, homeschool, you had pods developed. And I've been talking about that as a big bright spot, of the kind of COVID mess of the last 2 years. The parents are realizing, hey, I can spend more time with my kids, and it doesn't cost that much. So instead of, in New Jersey, it costs $30,000 a pupil for the state to raise your kid from kindergarten $30,000 a year.
Right.
And what are we getting for that investment? Not much. I mean, what is the U.S. in? Not much.
And I mentioned the origin story. I forgot to say this. So again, master's degree, and I'm not trying to credential drop here. I think it's relevant. Master's degree in accounting and finance, a focus in taxation. You would think I would have learned something about the origin of money or the state monopoly on money or central banking. You'd think I would learn something about this going through that coursework. Not one peep, not one letter of Austrian economics, nothing about the origin of the state, nothing about the origin of the central bank, nothing about the immorality and the impracticality of legal monopolies in general, of which the central bank is the worst one in human history. We, especially as Americans, where we proclaim ourselves to be prideful free market capitalists, right? The market is the referee. We don't believe in authoritarian regimes. We don't, we have decentralized governance was kind of our original implementation. We're a republic model. Has anyone that actually considers themselves a proponent of free market capitalism stopped for one moment and wondered why we have a legal monopoly on money, which is the biggest and most important market in the world? Right? This would be equivalent to having a central pricing czar on automobiles or something, where we don't let the market decide how much a car costs. We go and ask a bureaucrat to set the price for us. And, we know, again, if you've studied that at all, you know all the disastrous consequences, right? This is why Soviet Russia collapsed, there was too much state intervention in the market. Prices were not discoverable. Therefore, information could not propagate throughout the economy. So the whole thing becomes uncoordinated, it misallocates all the capital, and it becomes insolvent. That is the fate of central planning. And here we are in the U.S., okay, we don't like central planning. We're free market capitalists. Yet in the very heart of the American economy, we have a titanic anti-capitalist institution called the central bank, the Fed, right? Money is one half of every transaction. So we are 50% Marxist right out of the gate. And I'm not being hyperbolic here. In the 1848 Manifesto to the Communist Party, measure number 5 reads, this is Marx writing to the Communist Party, how we implement this thing, a state monopoly exclusive over cash and credit. Central banking is directly out of the Marxist playbook, verbatim. It's not even an argument. Check me, fact check me if you want. And here we are, right? We are the supposed greatest success story for democracy and free market capitalism in human history, but we have at our heart this black institution called the central bank, and it's really bad.
Now
right?
Why
it's
we
used.
Celebrate. That's even why now we celebrate Alexander Hamilton. What are we trying to indoctrinate? It's very interesting. I mean, if you read a lot of Marx, you're like, this is already happening. Taxation of private property, elimination of familial ties, elimination of religious ties. People don't affiliate with a church anymore. People don't affiliate with their families. They're divided. It's quite interesting. If you read Marx, you're like, dude, we're here. I want to thank you, Robert Breedlove, for joining us. And in the final 60 seconds, what would you like to share that you haven't shared?
You and I have met on the beach in Kauai. We talked a lot about philosophy and money, but also Christianity. And there's a reason that Christ only flipped out once in the Bible. And he flipped out on, the people in the marketplace that were using dishonest weights and measures, right? They were lying in the scales used to evaluate market transactions. That was like a really terrible thing through the eyes of Christ. That is what central banking is. Central banking is a manipulation of the weights and measures of the global economy. So we know, for instance, we learned in the 20th century that it's really bad to attack freedom of speech. That's what every aspiring dictator first does. He tries to bury the voice of dissent. We know that's a bad recipe for human organization. I think in the 21st century, we're going to learn that attacking price signals, right, attacking the weights and measures, the money itself, is equally as bad as distorting free speech. And I think that's what Bitcoin is hopefully helping us solve. And I hope in life to just help shed light on that corruption and help us heal from it.
Powerful. It's a great way to end. If you read the Bible, it's kind of interesting. Weights and measures. When I was a kid, I would read the Bible and be like, what's this weights and measures business? It's all over the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, Old Testament, whatever you call it. And then it's all over with Christ. So there's an interesting history of money, kind of like your sailor interview. If you kind of have a biblical theology of money, it might lead you to a lot of the discussions you're having. So thank you. I want to thank you for joining us. Everybody go to the What is Money podcast and get the book, Thank God for Bitcoin. I want to thank you, Robert. And we'll hopefully do a 7-hour series tipping the scales of what we've been exploring. So thanks for joining us.